This case here is one that I've been waiting to take a look at for quite some time because as far as I know, this is the smallest case on the market that can fit a 360mm radiator. In fact, it's the only ITX case that I know of to fit a radiator that large. And that's a pretty impressive spec because some of the more compact mid-tower cases out there like the NZXT H510, they can't even fit 360mm rads, and here we have it in a case that's just 18 liters in volume. Now I won't spoil too much, but if you do need a small form factor case with some of the best CPU thermal performance that you can get, this should definitely be one to consider. But despite those very impressive thermals and radiator compatibility, there are quite a few things that you should know before you build in this case. So here it is, the Sliger SV590, an enthusiast approach on the vertical small form factor PC case. And before we dive in, I'll just say that I'm a big fan of this vertical orientation. It means that your PC barely takes up any room on your desk or on the floor, while still allowing for a ton of hardware on the inside. Having said that, at 18 liters, the SV590 is one of the larger vertical cases that I've built in. It's 4.5 liters larger than the NZXT H1, and it's also 12mm taller than the NZXT H510 mid-tower. We'll talk more about that height in just a minute because it does raise some issues. Just know that this is a fairly tall case. Now, I'll say that this is one of the more creative and cleaner designs that we've seen from Sliger, who also make the highly optimized Cerberus and SM series cases. This is the first time that I've seen these softly brushed and thinner panels from them, and I definitely do prefer it. There are still some spots that do look a bit rough around the edges, but for the most part, this is the highest quality case that I've seen them produce. One thing that does look a bit out of place here though is that cheap power button, which you could probably buy for around 50 cents at your local electronics shop. I personally would have liked to see something a bit more premium to suit the rest of the design. Another part that looks a bit out of place is the platform or stand that the SV590 is intended to be screwed onto, and the reason for this is that the bottom panel is not completely flat. So this is a problem with the design and manufacturing tolerances, but it's a pretty lazy solution if I'm honest. I guess they're also afraid of users just tipping over the case without it because it's so tall. One way to fix this though is to use the adhesive feet that I believe are intended for the platform stand, but just put these directly on the bottom of the case instead. Again, this isn't the intended way to use this case, but if you do it this way, you do keep that nice small footprint, and it's also completely stable as well. In terms of ventilation, the side panels are actually pretty blocked off in terms of cutout percentage. Most of the panel is metal, but this does allow for a decent enough amount of air to pass through the case and get to the radiator. The cutout pattern itself is a bit random, but it's a nice change from the usual hole punch, and personally I do think it suits the vertical design. The rear panel on the other hand is extremely well ventilated though, and that's exactly what we want to see for that big 360mm radiator. And that's one of the obvious reasons that the SV590 is so tall, but also the fact that you've got a fair bit of wiggle room here to play with for the tallest of 360mm radiators to fit. So if you're planning on using a 360mm rad with a bit of extra height at the bottom and top, it should still fit fine in the SV590. In terms of thickness clearance, you've got 60mm in total to work with, which basically means your standard AIO with a 30mm thick radiator and 25mm thick fans, plus a bit of wiggle room. For the test build, I used the NZXT Kraken X73, and I did find that the pump leads were almost too short to reach, and that they actually do push on the side panel a bit more than I'd like. If you are looking for the best compatibility for this case, I'd instead recommend going with the unbranded Acertec 360mm AIO that you can find directly on Sliger's website. And of course, don't bother with air cooling unless you're using something really low power and liquid cooling the GPU instead, because cooler height clearance here only tops out at 55mm. Now, apart from the massive 360mm radiator compatibility, you can also install 3-slot graphics cards up to 390mm in length and 160mm in height. So basically, the biggest graphics cards in existence will fit in this case, no problem. Now, although I did say I'm a big fan of this vertical layout, there are a few things that bug me here on the SV590. So for starters, you've got this 2.5-inch drive bracket, which is included. So you can install up to 3 2.5-inch drives, no problem. By default, it is installed right between the motherboard and the power supply, so right here. But once you actually install a liquid cooler and cables, that is completely blocked, and this is pretty much impossible to get in there. You can't fit it because the cables are blocking there. So I think this could have been thought out a bit better. I would have liked to see the power supply shifted up closer to the motherboard, and then use that bottom area for something, maybe a location for a D5 or DDC pump, or maybe some additional storage. Also, I would have loved to see the case completely flipped vertically to allow your power and IO cables to connect at the bottom like the NZXT H1. Instead, they have to be passed all the way up to the top of the case, which I'm not a fan of at all. Obviously, I'm exaggerating here a bit with this cable mess, but with the ports up that high, you will need to pay more attention to cable management. Preferably, this is a case that is better suited under your desk. On a side note, seeing as this case has no top or rear IO ports, I'd also highly recommend using an external USB hub for much easier access. Otherwise, you'd need to remove that top panel every single time you need to plug something in. And the last consequence or oversight of this design is that if your motherboard uses a Wi-Fi and Bluetooth antennae like the ones shown, well, you're going to have your wireless connection completely cut since the top panel completely blocks it. Yes, you won't have Wi-Fi or Bluetooth with that top panel without external antennae. So for wireless connections in the SV590, you'll need to use leads that go outside of the case. Alright, so the ideal airflow strategy for the SV590 is to have the radiator fans pushing air onto the radiator and pulling it through the case like shown. This mostly concerns GPU thermals and both helping to exhaust the hot air but also encouraging air to pass through those side panels. But now let's go to the thermals, and starting with the CPU, they're really good. A 360mm AIO is easily the strongest cooling solution in this chart, and when paired with a decently ventilated case, we get the best result so far. The SV590 can beat the Ncase M1 while using fewer total fans in the system and at a lower fan RPM, but of course is around 5 to 6 liters larger. While the Ncase M1 is kind of portable at 12.5 liters, the SV590 isn't portable at all, but still this thermal result is very impressive. On the note of GPU thermals, seeing as that side panel ventilation is relatively blocked off, it does lead to a warmer result than we'd like. This also means that the GPU thermals benefit quite a lot by an increase in radiator fan speed, at which point we can tie the NZXT H1. However, do take note that the SV590 can accommodate much larger graphics cards with more effective coolers, not to mention a 360mm custom loop if that's what you're into. So while GPU thermals are on the warmer end here, you can effectively counter that with a larger card with more effective cooling. The card that we've used here for testing is just a 2-slot dual fan GTX 1080 Ti. So overall, if you are really pushing the components that you're trying to squeeze into an ITX build, this is definitely one to consider, but it's not cheap. This is Sliger's most premium case yet at $279 with free shipping in the US, making it one of the most expensive cases that I've reviewed. However, one way to think of it is if you need a 360mm radiator to cool your CPU and a 3-slot graphics card, then you're probably using very high-end components. This isn't a case for a Ryzen 5 and an RTX 2060. This is a case for a 3950X and a 2080 Ti. So while the case is expensive, it kind of lines up with the market of people who would be using this case. And on the bright side, although the pricing is quite steep, the availability from Sliger has been known to be pretty good, relative to other small form factor case manufacturers. So you can count on these being in stock pretty much most of the year. Personally, I think the SV590 is one of the better, for sure, SFF cases that I've reviewed. And I know it's 18 liters, it's not technically as small as it gets. But if you're after a desktop machine or something to put under your desk with a small footprint, this is a really good option if you're pushing those really high-end components. And calling it one of the better small form factor cases that I've tested, it's saying a lot because this case has a lot to improve on. I think a V2 with some of the changes that I mentioned, maybe some better ventilation for the side panels, maybe shift that power supply up closer to the motherboard and use that space down the bottom for something else. I think this could be a real killer case. It definitely doesn't feel as refined or optimized as something like the Ncase M1, but I think in its current state, it is still a really good option for compact enthusiast builds. So if you are interested, I will leave a link down below. As always, a huge thanks for watching, and I'll see you all in the next one.